Thank you, Dennis. Thanks to Felicia for the opening remarks. I appreciate especially her talking about gumption. It's one of those things that we need to keep in mind, and the way in which we need to focus our efforts and really try to make a difference. And I want to think about a different word today. I want to think about not just gumption, but I want to think about this word shovel readiness. I don't know if you remember shovel readiness. It's a term that I first heard during the previous downturn of 2008 when we talked about the infrastructure that we were going to rebuild to stimulate the economy. And for me, the frustration behind shovel readiness is that it means that a lot of innovative ideas for doing things differently may not get built because there's pressure to create projects and to spend infrastructure money on things that we know we can get going quickly, that won't get tied up in the permitting process, that engineers are willing to put into their plans and stick their stamps on, and that the public can get behind immediately. And that really constrains us when we want to do something differently. And knowing the threat that climate change poses to our water systems and to our communities, it's time to start acting differently. And I think this idea that shovel readiness and the attitude behind shovel readiness gets in the way is particularly relevant when we talk about nature-based solutions. Many of the innovative nature-based solutions to water quality problems that we've seen are one-off projects, and they don't tend to get scaled and built in other places. And part of that is this sense of shovel readiness. And so with that in mind, I want to talk about a specific type of nature-based solution, which is gaining attention and popularity in the Bay Area, and that's the horizontal levee. And I want to today think about first nature-based solutions on their own and why they don't necessarily get built and why there may be forces that we can start to use to put them at a greater advantage and make it more likely they'll get built. And then I want to come and think about the actual idea of horizontal levees for the Bay Area. So I want to think more initially about this concept of nature-based treatment solutions. And I want to go through quickly a table of you. And I'm going to start by being a pessimist. I'll think about the cons and then I'll think about the pros. And so in my pessimistic view of why nature-based treatment systems are often less attractive than engineered constructed systems, especially for water quality, is their lack of efficiency. So if you think about the way in which we treat water, the way in which we remove contaminants from wastewater, the way in which we move water around, it's often the idea that in an engineered treatment system, we take processes that are slow and inefficient in nature, and we make them go faster by creating conditions that are particularly conducive to treatment. And so when you talk about nature-based treatment systems, you recognize that perhaps they take more land than a constructed treatment system, or perhaps they ultimately turn out to be more expensive because they move slowly and they need more time and effort to make them work. So that stands in the way and tends to bias us against nature-based treatment systems. Unreliable. Nature-based treatment systems, like all natural systems, undergo diurnal and annual cycling. And so many of our nature-based treatment systems go to sleep in the wintertime because that's what biology tends to do. When the sunlight becomes less intense, when the temperatures decrease, processes slow down. And in engineered systems, constructed systems that rely upon mechanical systems or biology being optimized in a treatment plant, that doesn't happen. And then finally, many of our nature-based treatment systems are in some sense unbuildable. And I mean in that way, not that it's impossible to build them, but the hurdles that stand in their way with respect to financing and permitting and regulatory and public acceptance slow them down. And so in the challenge to get these things built, or the amount of time that money gets tied up while we try to build nature-based treatment systems, one could go and build a conventional gray infrastructure type project and have it up and running. So with all of those things working against nature-based treatment systems, when would we ever build them? Well, one of the things that stands behind nature-based systems and makes them particularly attractive is this idea that they provide multiple benefits. So a wastewater treatment plant might be very good at removing nutrients from wastewater and protecting San Francisco Bay, but it's not going to provide habitat, and it's not going to protect the community from sea level rise. And a nature-based system has the kinds of characteristics that tend to engender multiple benefits, whether they're aesthetic, whether they're wildlife, that we just don't see from conventional constructed infrastructure. Also, when we think about nature-based treatment systems, they often score better in the sustainability indices that we use. So when we think about the triple bottom line of nature-based treatment systems, they do have social benefits. They tend to produce fewer greenhouse gases, and they tend to touch all the right buttons that we normally think about when we think about sustainability. And because of the multi-beneficial nature of nature-based systems and the sustainable attributes of these systems, they're eminently supportable by members of the public. So you won't see community members or environmental groups coming out to support and help build a sewage treatment plant, but you'll get members of the community coming to help you when you want to propose or even build a nature-based treatment system. And so that's really something that stands to benefit them. So when we look at this question of shovel readiness, we have to overcome the cons and emphasize the pros. And so I want to come to think about the nature-based treatment system that's turning out to have the greatest traction here in the Bay Area, especially as we look towards protecting our communities from sea level rise and creating a more resilient water supply, not relying upon imported water coming into the Bay Area and increasing our amount of recycled water. And that's the horizontal levee. Now, what is a horizontal levee? Well, those of us who've been working on the horizontal levee, my co-authors and I have been trying to define this now for a few years. We are part of this organization that is funded by the EPA, that's administered under the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, where we have these convenings to think about nature-based treatment systems. And one of those convenings, we were asked to put in our own words what a horizontal levee is. And you can go to that YouTube link and see what we all say about it. But I'll give you my take on what a horizontal levee is, especially in the context of this talk. So if we want to think about the coastline, most of the Bay Area is surrounded by constructed levees, and these levees are protecting our communities from storm surges and in the future, increasingly from sea level rise. And on the bay side of these constructed levees, we tend to have riprap and other types of materials that are armoring them and protecting them from storm surges. And the idea behind the horizontal levee is part of a larger vision of integrating the levees that we've built and that we're going to build in the future with a natural treatment system that can be used to improve the quality of water that's being discharged by sewage treatment plants to the bay. And when you put this together with other types of wetland restoration projects, you end up with improvements in habitat on the edges of the bay, better protection of those constructed levees from the energy of storm surges, and an aesthetic feature that maybe provide recreational options for the public. And so this is something that really makes the horizontal levee quite attractive. And it's an idea that was developed by my co-author of this talk, Jeremy Lowe at the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and his colleagues at ESA and others at the time that they started the project. Now, what is the real horizontal levee? It's part of a project at the Oraloma Sanitary District. We call it the Shoreline Adaptation Demonstration Lab, and it's a small part of the Oraloma Sanitary District's wastewater treatment plant. It was an opportunity to build a horizontal levee demonstration site when the plant was upgrading a wet weather treatment basin. And so with a $2.1 million grant from the IRWIMP program and $3 million from the Oraloma Sanitary District, a wet weather facility was augmented with a horizontal levee. And you can see here the location of the Oraloma Sanitary District plant and a photo of the horizontal levee demonstration site. Maybe more relevant than the photo would be to look at a plan view of the facility, which is set up as a test lab to understand what different types of fill material and plantings can do with respect to improving water quality. So you can see these 12 separate lanes. They almost look like bowling alley lanes going from top to bottom. And what we do is we put into the wetland, the influent, which is actually the sewage effluent from the Oraloma Sanitary District's treatment plant. We put those into these wetlands in the subsurface, and it flows through the wetlands, and there are places where we can sample the water on the way, and then it flows out the end and back to the headworks of the treatment plant. We first planted this in 2015, and you can see a picture here of what the site looked like. We basically just had fill material, sand and clay brought in, and then the folks from Save the Bay helped culture native plants from the bay type environments that are typical of this kind of wetland. And we just put in these little twigs, maybe most of them were about this long. And after a couple of years, they had turned into a thriving wetland. You can see in this middle picture here, Aidan Cacchetti, who did most of the research on this as part of his dissertation, hidden among the willow trees that grew up just within 2 years. And then you can see in the other image there, the sedges and rushes that are typical of other parts of the wetland. So it's a very attractive place with lots of native plants and habitat. And in that first 2 years, it grew like gangbusters. And then since then, the growth rate has leveled out, and we've been able to track this with using drone technology and ways of ground truthing that by seeing the growth rates. But it's pretty much reached maturity in about 4 years. And what we've done is we've been passing the wastewater effluent from the Oraloma Sanitary District's treatment plant, so-called nitrified effluent, where the nitrogen species in the wastewater have all been turned into nitrate. We've been passing it through a layer of gravel and coarse sand at the bottom of the wetland. So this is a cross section. It's about 1 meter thick, and the lower 2/3 of it or so is this sand and gravel layer. And in the sand and gravel layer, we put some wood chips. And those wood chips act as a home for microbes that grow in a biofilm. And the microbes are the key to this. They're degrading the nitrate, turning it into nitrogen gas, and they're degrading organic chemicals. And then on the surface, we have the wetland plants, and they stick their roots down and sip water out of that sand and gravel layer. And that's how we're able to keep these plants alive on the elevated surface of the horizontal levee. Well, how does the horizontal levee work? It works well if you keep the water underground. And so these two figures here show you the removal of nitrate and pharmaceutical compounds in some of the horizontal levee cells compared to the removal when the water flows over the surface. So what we found over time is that we had to restrict the amount of water that we were passing through the levee so that none of it was flowing over the surface. And that meant cutting down the flow so the water was only moving through that sand and gravel layer. And when we did that, we were able to remove nitrate within the first 10 meters of the slope. And surprisingly to us, just about every pharmaceutical compound that we were able to measure in the wastewater disappeared in that first 10 meters of the horizontal levee. And we were pretty excited about that until we sat down and did some calculations. And we calculated that by the time we turned the flow of the horizontal levee down enough to get the water through the subsurface, we were only putting about 25,000 gallons a day through the wetland. And we did a back of the envelope calculation of how much land we would need to dispose of all of the wastewater effluent from the Oraloma Sanitary District site. And we calculated something like 44 miles or 71 kilometers. And that just seemed, given the cost of building these horizontal levees and the land available, to be something that was pretty untenable. And so we were a little bit down about that until we started having more discussions with our friends at Valley Water, who at the time were thinking about their potable water reuse project. And one of the main concerns, you'll probably hear this from Hussein a little later today with the Valley Water project, is what to do with the reverse osmosis concentrate that they produce during the water recycling process. So in Southern California, that reverse osmosis concentrate just goes out into the ocean through the sewage discharge of the existing treatment plants. And because it goes through diffusers and mixes into the ocean, it's considered not to be a problem. But when you look at the South Bay, the area around Palo Alto and Sunnyvale, where they're planning to build this recycling plant, there just isn't a lot of mixing with ocean water or bay water. And so it could be a problem. So we recognize that The problem that we were facing in the potable water reuse project was an opportunity for horizontal levees, because if instead of putting wastewater effluent into the horizontal levee, you put reverse osmosis concentrate, the area that you would need to treat that water would come down by somewhere between a factor of 6 and a factor of 7, because in the RO process, we capture about 85% of the water, which creates this concentrated brine, which is about 6 or 7 times more concentrated than the wastewater. And so with the help of Valley Water, we started shipping the RO concentrate from the Silicon Valley Advanced Water Purification Plant up to Orloma. And you can see a comparison here of the nitrate removal in the horizontal levee. That's the solid lines, the orange and the yellow line, with the wastewater effluent from the Orloma Sanitary District. And you can see we're getting essentially the same performance. The nitrate is removed in the first 10 meters of the levee. We see similar kinds of things with the pharmaceuticals. I just didn't bother to put them up here. And so suddenly we were dropping the area we needed from something like 44 miles to a little over 6 miles. And that started looking more reasonable. And more recently, the team has been involved in some discussions of how we might drop that further. And I'll share with you one of the concepts of how we might reduce that area further. Recall that this is a plan view here at the top, and then the bottom is a cross section. Recall that all of the action is happening in the first 10 meters of the horizontal levee, and the horizontal levee is about 45 meters long. So we could essentially plumb this. So we have 4 separate cells treating water and introducing water at 4 different points. So if we introduce water, as shown in the top gray, through 4 different subsurface pipes and take it out after it's been in the levee for about 10 meters, we could reduce the footprint that we need by another factor of 4. So when all is said and done, you're somewhere maybe a little less than 2 miles or as much as 6 miles to manage all of the RO concentrate that would be produced if the Orloma Sanitary District decided to put in a reverse osmosis potable water reuse system. And so this figure here gives you an idea of what 2 miles and 6 miles would look like at Orloma. So these are not necessarily the locations that we're planning to build horizontal levees, but it just gives you an idea in terms of distance. Essentially, if you had 6 miles of horizontal levees, you'd be going from the San Mateo Bridge up to the bottom of the Oakland Airport. That's the orange plus the blue here. And if you only had 2 miles, it would be the area immediately above and below the Orloma Sanitary District, building those levees. And that, that gives you a sense of it. And then if you're thinking, well, what does it cost to build these? Our latest estimate of the construction costs of the horizontal levees are somewhere between $10 and $20 million a mile. And so we're talking about, at the minimum, $20 to $40 million, all the way up to 60 or $120 million. But again, when we talk about big infrastructure projects, those are the magnitudes we think about. I also mentioned early on, one of the cons about nature-based treatment systems is their resiliency or their seasonality. And I used to content myself with the idea that in the San Francisco Bay, it's not such a big deal if our treatment systems slow down in the winter, because that's when we get all the rain that flushes contaminants out of the bay. I think that way of making myself feel better about this has kind of gone out the window a little bit with the recent droughts. And so I was very happy to see in our data that the nitrate removal in the horizontal levee doesn't really slow down in the wintertime. And this is a complex figure. This is the kind of thing that someone who works on biogeochemistry, like some of us team members do, might be really excited about. But I'll just cut to the chase and tell you that in the summertime, the nitrate is removed in the wetland through the process of denitrification in that first 5 or 10 meters. And the organisms doing it are the biofilm organisms living off of the organic carbon. And in the wintertime, those organisms slow down because that denitrification enzyme is susceptible to temperature decreases. And organisms that denitrify water using iron sulfides as their energy source make up for the slack. And so we still see excellent removal of nitrate in the wintertime because the microbial community responsible for the process switches to organisms that are better adapted to the colder wintertime temperatures. So enough of the science here. I think the real question when we get to this question of gumption and shovel readiness is getting these things built. And so there really are two types of permitting challenges that we need to overcome. The first is related to water quality. And when we think about water quality, we're really talking about the NPDES permits, the permits that were established under the Clean Water Act. And those Clean Water Act permits, think about everything coming out of the end of a pipe. And so you need to have a point of compliance, and the point of compliance is usually the end of the pipe coming out of your treatment plant. Well, what does it mean when the end of your treatment process is actually a subsurface wetland that's seeping into the bay? Where do you collect samples, and how do you give people credit? And so some of our discussions that we've been having with various individuals associated with the regulatory process think about this question of maybe the point of compliance is still the pipe coming into the constructed wetland or the horizontal levee, but you get credit for installing the horizontal levee because it's a best management practice. And there's precedent for this in other areas of pollution control. And then if you monitor this thing to verify that the horizontal levee is actually performing, and it's subject to the normal renewal process of these permits every 5 years, there's a way to control things in case it doesn't work out as it's planned. So I think the water quality part is tractable ultimately. The second piece is the idea that if you're building these horizontal levees, you're putting fill into the bay, and putting fill into the bay has been an area of considerable controversy over the years. And so there's a very complicated permitting process involving the Army Corps of Engineers, the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA Fisheries, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and BCDC. They come together in an organization called the BRIT. And what we see is that the BRIT has already started to think about wetland restoration projects, not projects involving treatment, but restoration projects. And they have some ideas, and I think they serve as a useful starting point for further discussions. But it's still maybe the Achilles heel of this process. And thinking in terms of Achilles heel and old legends, I like to come back to the legend of Alexander cutting the Gordian knot, because really sometimes it takes a talented leader to understand that the solution to a problem is often the simple one that involves making things happen and making sure that things get done rather than talking about the best way to unwind a complicated mess. I talked also about multi-benefit solutions, and we often talk qualitatively about multi-benefit solutions because they're hard to wrap your arms around. But a few years ago, one of my doctoral students, Sasha Harris-Lovett, studied this idea of the multi-benefit aspects of nature-based treatment systems relative to other types of alternatives by interviewing a variety of utility managers and regulators and non-governmental organization representatives around the Bay Area to try to understand their preferences. And this is the result of something called the multi-criteria decision analysis on different ways of reducing nitrogen going into San Francisco Bay, which is one of the biggest problems that the Bay is facing right now. And consistently, the horizontal levee came out as the preferred alternative. And the reason it came out as the preferred alternative wasn't necessarily what people thought of in terms of its price, but it really seemed to be a combination of the multiple benefits of it, the sense that you could also not only solve a water pollution problem, but you could simultaneously provide aesthetic benefits and possibly habitat, as well as protecting the levees from sea level rise and storm surges. And so, we think that there's good evidence that it's something that is well supported in the water community around the Bay Area. And then finally, when this question of horizontal levees and where they might be built comes up, we can see that there are many, many opportunities here in the Bay Area. So this comes out of the adaptation atlas that SFEI and the state and the Regional Water Quality Control Board put together. All of the pink areas in this map show you possible locations of horizontal levees. And you can see that just about everywhere in the Bay Area that we have a sewage treatment plant, with a few exceptions, there are opportunities for building horizontal levees. And in fact, in addition to our work at Oraloma, there are now nascent projects getting underway in Palo Alto and Richmond and maybe possibly one in Hayward in the near future. So these things are becoming not only talked about more, but we see the potential to scale them up and build them in many places. So maybe some final thoughts about this. I would contend that we have to start thinking about horizontal levees as approaching this point of shovel readiness. Maybe we'll never know everything there is to know about horizontal levees. We usually don't learn a lot until we build things at full scale. And we've been nursing our way around with this demonstration project at Oraloma Sanitary District. And over time, we're hoping that we'll build a few miles at a time and learn how to build these things and make them really reproducible and less expensive. The permitting challenges are large, but I'd like to think that they're not insurmountable. They're institutional barriers, and people are the ones who make the institutions. And I think we need some leadership to start cutting the Gordian knot that threatens to tie us up and prevent this from happening. And finally, I don't mean to be trite or corny, but when we think about sustainability and we think about the challenges of climate change, we can think about the idea, if not us, then who? And more importantly, if not now, then when? And I really think that that's motivation to continue to move ahead on these kinds of nature-based treatment processes. And with that, that's the end of my remarks, Dennis. I could stop sharing my screen and we could have a few minutes of discussion.
Great, yes. Thank you, Dr. Sedlak. The biggest challenge, I think, towards doing this talk was finding out which of the areas that you're involved in to talk about. And I think this is certainly a timely one, just with the horizontal levees. You see the potential locally. Actually, there was a question in the Q&A as far as are there, from Laura Metters, are there other areas in the US it would make sense to use horizontal levees?
Yeah, that's a good question, Laura. We've been focused in the San Francisco Bay Area now. I imagine that these ideas have some relevance in places like the Chesapeake or the East Coast, where nutrient problems are a major concern. I'm not sure about the Pacific Northwest and whether what the prognosis is. I've actually had some interesting discussions with folks in China. I think they're, the Sponge City initiative that the Chinese government has been pursuing is particularly well suited for this kind of thing.
There's another a question actually, which I was thinking about too, is talking about sea level rise. As sea level rise occurs, will the levees be submerged and need to be moved inland?
Sea level rise is going to continue not just for the next 80 years, but probably for the next 1,000 years, unfortunately, as thermal expansion of the oceans and melting continues. So everything along the shoreline is going to have to be moved, and it's just a question of when. We think that the horizontal levees buy time for the constructed levees that are being put in now by protecting them from storm surges, because the way in which a levee fails is not like a bathtub filling up with water. It's one big storm comes and breaches it and starts to destroy it. It's really just a question of when. So maybe we're going to buy a couple of more decades with the horizontal levee that we wouldn't have if we didn't protect them in this way. But eventually, a lot of the coastal infrastructure in the Bay Area, the stuff that was built in reclaimed land, is either going to have to rise higher or move back.
And lastly, we have a question from Tom Francis. It's, I'll say, over the coming years, the Bay Area Water Board is working towards eliminating discharge into the bay, but also, well, there's a kind of a long question. This is driving interest in potable and indirect potable use projects. As these levees create habitat and presumably wetland areas, do you sense that there will always be a need to keep these projects active, reserving some flow for their use and support? Could these facilities be in conflict with what the Water Board desires for the future?
Right. That's a good question, Tom. Actually, what these are doing is they're treating the RO, when we shift over to treating RO concentrate, we're enabling those potable water reuse projects. And so unless someone comes up with a way to do potable water reuse without that reverse osmosis step, or finds a much less expensive way of managing the salty brine produced by the process, there's going to be a source of water for them. And so we think that the likelihood that we're going to no longer need to manage that RO concentrate is going to be many decades away. It's just right now, any other way of doing potable water reuse, especially with the levels of salt in the wastewater initially in California, seem like they're pretty expensive and impractical still. So I think there's good reason to think that over a period of 20 or 30 or 40 years, the potable water reuse projects that are being built now will continue to need a place to put their RO concentrate.
Thank you. All quite good questions as well. So appreciate that. But definitely appreciate Dr. Sedlak for coming in and starting us off on this, and certainly hope that a lot of the green infrastructure prevails in infrastructure packages, and that a lot of those areas that you circled around the bay get addressed